There's no distinction between civilians and combatants.
There should be.
And no, now you're doing what Moeen said. You're becoming very selective about the law. If you want to forget about the law, Hamas had every right to do what it did. It had every right to do what it did, according to you, not to me, because you want to forget the law.
Do you still support the Houthis shooting random ships?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a violation of international law, so you play the same game.
Absolutely. And were there a power during World War II that had that kind of courage?
Courageous to be bombing merchant ships while tens of...
The courage to... Where the kidnap people?
The negotiations are divided into three parts for the sake of listeners. There's Camp David in July 2000. There are the Clinton parameters in December 2000. And then there are negotiations in Taba in Egypt in 2001. Those are the three phases. Now, I have studied the record probably to the point of insanity because there are so many details you have to master.
I'll vouch for that. The insanity part, yeah.
I will vouch for it. I will personally vouch for it. There is one extensive record from that whole period from 2000 to, you could say, 2007. And that is what came to be called the Palestine Papers, which were about 15,000 pages of all the records of the negotiations.
15,000
I have read through all of them, every single page. And this is what I find. If you look at Shlomo Ben Ami's book, which I have with me.
Bro, I should be Normal Finkelstein. He's going to die soon, isn't he? Sorry, he needs to talk slowly for you guys. What am I doing at 1.5? You guys are dumb. You guys don't read single-spaced works.
I have studied the record probably to the point of insanity because there are so many details you have to master.
I'll vouch for that. The insanity part. Yeah.
I will vouch for it. I will personally vouch for it. My standard is, what does international law say?
Oh my.
International law says the settlements are illegal.
Now prepare for a bunch of things that international law maybe says, but also probably doesn't for some other ones. Okay, let's go.
Israel wants to keep all the settlement blocks. 15 judges, all 15, in the Wall decision in 2004, in July 2004, all 15 judges, including the American judge Bergenthal, ruled the settlements are illegal under international law. They want to keep 80% of the settlers. Under international law, all the settlers are illegal in the West Bank. They want to keep large parts of East Jerusalem. But under international law, East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. That's what the international...
No, not Palestinian, because there was no Palestine.
Okay.
There's never been a Palestinian state. How could it be Palestinian?
I listened patiently to you.
No.
Sorry.
Under international law, if you read the decision, all territory, they're not 2004 wall.
He's not going to say that it needs to all be withdrawn from, is he? Because that's not in the 2004 case. I read it. I read half of it. Okay, but it's not there. Okay. I skimmed hard.
Decision. All territory beyond the Green Line, which includes East Jerusalem, is occupied Palestinian territory.
Exception of the Golan Heights.
The designated unit, according to the international...
It's an advisory opinion. It's not legally binding. Okay. Let's see that word, actually. Not binding. But in any case, it's an opinion. It's a legal opinion from a big court. It's ICJ, isn't it? Yeah. They talk about withdrawal. And everything here is just them quoting 242, if I remember. But I've heard him characterizing this advisory opinion and say that it called for Israel to withdraw as if almost like unilaterally. But this, I think, is this 242 or is this from the court? I need to find out who these statements are each from because it's not all the court's opinion, which can be confusing. Separate opinion of judge. Okay, one of the judges. So there's a separate opinion. The court, for the very first time, without any particular legal analysis, implicitly also adopted the second perspective. I approve of the principle invoked, but am puzzled as to its application in the present case. Self-determination is the right of all peoples, freely to determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. As this opinion observes, it is now accepted that the Palestinian people are a peoples for purposes of self-determination. But it seems to me quite detached from reality for the court to find that it is the wall that presents a serious impediment to exercise this right. The real impediment is the apparent inability and or unwillingness of both Israel and Palestine to move in parallel to secure the necessary conditions, that is, at one and the same time, for Israel to withdraw from Arab-occupied territory and for Palestine to provide the conditions to allow Israel to feel secure in so doing. The simple point is underscored by the fact that if the wall had never been built, the Palestinians would still not yet have exercised their right to self-determination. It seems to be unrealistic and unbalanced for the court to find that the wall, rather than the larger problem, which is beyond the question, put to the court for an opinion. Yeah, so they're saying the occupation is this wasn't about whether they should withdraw from the entire territory. They're just talking about 242. It's just being cited, 242. The real impact. This will be the same. Yeah, we're back. Yeah, it just doesn't say what he's saying it says. It's also not legally binding.
Court of Justice, the designated unit for Palestinian self-determination.
So what did he say about it? About that thing we were just looking at?
Palestinian territory.
The exception of the Golan Heights.
The designated unit, according to the International Court of Justice, the designated unit for Palestinian self-determination. And they deny any right whatsoever on the right of return. The maximum, I don't want to go into the details now, the maximum formal offer was by Ehud Olmert in 2008. He offered 5,000 refugees could return under what was called family reunification, 5,000 in the course of 5 years, and no recognition of any Israeli responsibility. So, if you use as the baseline what the UN General Assembly has said and what the International Court of Justice has said.
The Dahia Doctrine, you're telling me to read it? Read it again yourself. It's not about targeting civilians, okay? That's not what the Dahia Doctrine is about. Anyways, sorry.
If you use that baseline...
It's very bad. It's not like a good policy, but it's not targeting civilians. It's not the same thing.
International law, by that baseline, all the concessions came from the Palestinian side. Every single concession came from the Palestinian side. None came from the Israeli side. They may have accepted less than what they wanted, but it was still beyond what international law allocated to them. Now, you say...
Allocated to the Palestinians.
Allocated to Palestinians, yes. Thank you for the clarification. Now, about Arafat. Liked the Mufti, never liked the guy. I think that was one of the only disagreements Mouin and I had when Arafat passed. You were a little sentimental, I was not. Never liked the guy. But politics, you don't have to like the guy. There was no question, nobody argues it, that whenever the negotiations started up, the Palestinians just kept saying the same things.
No.
No.
They kept saying no.
No. Professor Morris, with due respect, incorrect. They kept saying international legitimacy, international law, UN resolutions. They said, we already gave you what the law required. We gave that in 1988, November 1988, and then ratified again at Oslo in 1993. And they said, now we want what was promised us.
Try heat. The Dahia Doctrine proves Israel explicitly targets civilians. I don't know what the fuck you're reading. Read it again. Or try and find a more neutral source because, no, sorry.
Under international law. And that was the one point where everybody on the other side agreed. Clinton, don't talk to me about international law. Livni, during the Olmert administration, she said, I studied international law. I don't believe in international law. Every single member on the other side, they didn't want to hear from international law. And to my thinking, that is the only reasonable baseline for trying to resolve the conflict and Israel has, along with
Well,
the US.
when has international law been relevant to any conflict
that's
basically
why,
in the world?
Hey, that's why.
It's also, is the Dahia Doctrine, is it actually Israeli policy? I think it was it was an IDF general who outlined it, but I don't think it's official Israeli policy, is it?
For the last 150
That's why the
years.
Palestinians have to recognize Israel, because that's international law.
No, but international law is
UN
meaningless.
That was UN Resolution
Conflicts are not
242.
solved by international law or in accordance with international
Yeah,
law.
but then, Professor Morris, for argument's sake, let's agree on that. Strictly for argument's sake. What's the alternative? Dennis Ross said, we're going to decide who gets what on the basis of needs. So he says, Israel needs this, Israel needs that, Israel needs that. Dennis Ross decided to be the philosopher king. He's going to decide on the basis of needs. Well, if you asked me, since Gaza is one of the densest places on earth, it needs a
Tel
good
Aviv.
yes,
It needs part of Sinai.
It needs
That's
a
what
nice
Gaza-
big chunk
of Sinai.
Well, not Sinai.
That's what it
Oh.
actually needs.
Okay, I don't even want to go there.
Part of
It needs a
Sinai.
nice big chunk, but I have to accept international law says no.
Yeah, but
Okay,
international law is irrelevant.
Now Ben Ami says, I think
Also, again, there's nothing about international. Is he going to refer to 242 about the 67 borders? Like, there's nothing about international law that says the 67 borders are gospel. The 67 borders, you know what the 67 borders are? Let's have a look. And this is by the people who came up with 242 as well. Was it Lord? Let me see. I don't know. 1967 borders. We can find the statements from the people who drafted Resolution 242. Their framework, yeah, that's not the same as a law, right? There's only one correct answer to what these things are, right? The green line, the 67 borders. Do you know what these are? Yeah. You know what this is? These green lines. This is just where some soldiers were in 1949 on some evening. It's an armistice line. That's it. It doesn't speak to the territorial and to the specific needs of the situation in 2024, nor did it speak to the specific needs in 1999 or 93 or 2000 or 2001. Yeah, this is just an armistice line. That's why 242 was deliberately made vague. The Soviets wanted 242 to say immediately withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, and I don't even know who they'd have gone to. Maybe back to Jordan and Egypt, but they didn't get that. They got a very ambiguously stated quote, Resolution 242. They got a very vague and highly debated statement that Israel withdraw armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. They deliberately don't say the territories or all the territories. They don't say which territories. They just say from territories. And that was deliberate. It was deliberate because withdrawal would have to be part of a bilateral agreement. And there is no reason that the 67 borders have to be exactly where that withdrawal occurs, especially if there are settlers, but also if there's actually land that Palestinians might be more entitled to along the edges here, or for a larger Gaza Strip. Nice interpretation. That is not my interpretation, you fucking moron. That's the reason they did it. Shall we get the interpretation of the people who drafted it? Yosef, do you want to contest me on that? Hang on. What was the Lord's name? Lord 242. Where is it? Okay. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get the Wikipedia quote from you just to trigger you guys. Okay. This is him talking to the UN Security Council in November 67. All of us recognize that peace is the prize. None of us wishes a temporary truce or a superficial accommodation. We would never advocate a return to uneasy hostility. As I have said, my government would never wish to be associated with any so-called settlement, which was only a continuation of a false truce. And all of us, without any hesitation at all, can agree that we seek a settlement within the principles laid down in Article 2 of the Charter. So much for the preamble. As for the first operative paragraph, and with due respect for fulfillment of Charter principles, we consider essential that there should be applied the principles of both withdrawal and security, and we have no doubt that the words set out throughout that paragraph are perfectly clear. As to the second operative paragraph, I believe there is no vestige of disagreement between us and us all that there must be a guarantee of freedom of navigation through international waterways. There must be a just settlement of the refugee problem, guarantee and adequate means, territorial availability. Third operative paragraph, where's the bit about the 6-7 borders? Oh yeah. Knowing as I did the unsatisfactory nature of the 6-7 line, I was not prepared to use wording in the resolution which would have made that line permanent. Nevertheless, it is necessary to say again that the overriding principle was the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war, and that meant that there could be no justification for annexation of territory on the Arab side of the 6-7 line merely because it had been conquered in the 6-7 war. Okay, so he's disagreeing with East Jerusalem and the annexations around the West Bank on the border. The sensible way to decide permanent, secure, and recognized boundaries would be to set up a boundary commission and hear both sides, and then to make impartial recommendations for a new frontier line, bearing in mind, of course, the inadmissibility principle, which would probably justify the land swaps, right? Arthur Goldberg, does Resolution 242, as unanimously adopted by the UN Security Council, require the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from all of the territories occupied by Israel during the 6-7 war? The answer is, Yusuf, you listening? Yusuf. Take the congealed cum plugs out of your ears and listen, okay? The answer is no. In the resolution, the words "the" and "all" are omitted. Resolution 242 calls for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the 6-7 conflict without specifying the extent of the withdrawal. The resolution, therefore, neither commands nor prohibits total withdrawal. If the resolution is ambiguous and purposely slow, so, on this crucial issue, how is the withdrawal issue to be settled? By direct negotiations between the concerned parties. Resolution 242 calls for agreement between them to achieve a peaceful and accepted settlement. Agreement and acceptance necessarily require negotiations. Okay. The answer is yes. Dry heat. Lord Ambassador, dry heat.
The Israeli offer was reasonable. Okay, that's
And he's a reasonable guy.
He seems even though, okay, I don't want to go there. I've debated him, and part I agree with you. But who decides what's reasonable? I think the international...
I really got you to read that. Yeah, well, you said something retarded, and I pushed back on it, That's just doing my job. Jen Sarek, thanks for the $2. Being slow, bicep. Being repetitive, bicep. Finkelstein, true. Jamie A199, thanks very much. This is where Destiny sounds very silly. Okay.
Community in its political incarnation, the General Assembly, the Security Council, all those UN Security Council resolutions saying the settlements are illegal, annexation of East Jerusalem is null and void, and the International Court of Justice. That, to me, is a reasonable standard. And by that standard, the Palestinians were asked to make concessions, which I consider unreasonable, or the international community considers unreasonable.
I think that the issue is when you apply international law or international standards, I wouldn't say what Benny Moore says that they're irrelevant, but I think that these have to be seen as informing the conversation. I don't think these are the final shape of the conversation. I don't think historically Israel has ever negotiated within the strict bounds of whether we're talking Resolution 242, whether we're talking about any General Assembly resolutions. That's just not how these negotiations tend to go. You might consider international opinion on things, but at the end of the day, it's the bilateral negotiations, oftentimes historically started in secret, independent of the international community, that end up shaping what the final...
Zionist freaks, international law doesn't matter. No, the fact is unfortunately, no one gives a fuck about international law, because half the things that they cite as international law are actually not international laws. Like, that's why Finkelstein is hedging his bet on what he thinks he read in a 2004 advisory opinion, which was not legally binding, but he'll call that international law. So he's wrong on two fronts. And you guys don't agree with international law either. Because again, like the same people who always appeal to international law will also say that the Arabs were right to reject the partition plan, which was voted on by the UN. And again, that wasn't international law. That wasn't legally binding. That was just General Assembly. But you guys are happy to use General Assembly resolutions and treat them as international law regardless. So you just don't have those standards. You don't give a
international agreements look like. I think
Don't generalize me. I have my own opinion and thoughts. You've just spent the last 5-10 minutes just spamming the Dahia doctrine as if you think that is explicit Israeli policy. And also because apparently you don't understand the difference between civilian people as targets and infrastructure, which again, infrastructure can often be evacuated. And even when they talk about the Dahia doctrine, even the people who talk about when they reference events where they were targeting infrastructure that was being used by both civilians and by Hezbollah. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't understand. It's dumb. It's so dumb. It's not the same as just saying, here's a target. What is it? Bunch of civilians. Kill them. That's not, has never been demonstrated, okay? From like the IDF Air Force or anything. Yeah, okay.
the issue with this broad appeal to international law is, again, going back to my earlier point about all of the euphemistic words, all it simply does is drive Palestinian expectations up to a
The
level.
legitimate criticism is that they have lax opinions on proportionality. That's it. Yeah. That's the more balanced, and that they're very happy to let a lot of collateral go just to take out like some militarily feasible target. That's much more in line with what they actually do. But you know,
Level that is never going to be satisfied. For instance, you can throw that ICJ opinion all you want. It was an advisory opinion. That came in 2004. Have Palestinians gained more or less land since that 2004 advisory opinion was issued?
So what would your standard be then?
Both sides have to have a delegation that confronts each other, and they assess the realistic conditions on the ground, and they try to figure out within the confines of international law whether both sides are reasonable for. But like, for instance, this statement of like full retreat from the West Bank, what is it, 400,000 settlers? How many settlers live in the West Bank now?
Probably 500,000.
Yeah, you're going to
depends if you include the Jerusalem suburbs.
Yeah,
or
400,000 or 500,000 people are never
with the Jerusalem suburbs, perhaps.
it's
And Israel calls
half a million people
Jerusalem, not settlements.
I know that, but that's not what the law calls it null and void.
we can say
Our Security Council and GA resolutions different. Yep, General Assembly, I'm pretty sure it's just when the UN countries just give their opinion on something, I think, which is not meaningless. It's just, but I think Security Council resolutions can be invoked to be legally binding. I don't think they're automatically legally binding, but I think they can be invoked legally. But that's where it gets complicated. That's where my international law knowledge ends, okay? Because there are 8 billion pages. I read them all and I dribbled over most of them and had porn on in the background, so sorry. And video games and Coca-Cola. And I was high.
you can say whatever we
What's
want
relevant?
until we're blue in the face, but like there's half a million Israeli people are not being expelled. from the West.
My
It's not gonna
response,
happen.
you're basically saying, if I understand correctly, there's only one way to resolve this, and that is through direct bilateral negotiation.
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
And
So
that was a double space version.
Or ideally, but
I've taken over your house. Okay. You're not going to go to the police because, you know, the law is only of limited value. So you come over and sit in what is now my living room that used to be your living
Your chat is boring as You're here, Joseph. That's your problem. Okay, do something with your life then. Fuck me. God, get the fuck out. Go. My chat is fun to engage with. Well, sorry.
room, and we negotiate. The problem there is that you're not going to get anything unless I agree to it. And standards and norms and law and all the rest of it be damned. So you need to take into account that when you're advocating bilateral negotiations, that effectively that gives each of the parties veto power. And in the current circumstance,
What the dispute, the rift, the chasm between Rubani and Finkelstein must be massive, because he thinks if he's using the house analogy, that kind of sounds like he wants to take all of it. He even said like Israel and all that, but like he thought it was actually justified for Hamas to claim territory in southern Israel. That's definitely not sanctioned by any international law. So I wonder what they would argue about over that. I feel like there are a few opportunities in this debate where you could have pinned these two against each other. Like a colonizer. I would have done it.
Palestinians have already recognized Israel.
And British,
they have,
after all.
They have.
Wait, what? You keep bringing that up like it's a significant
not true.
concession,
It's not
and I
true.
don't. And even if
It's called
It's not even
law.
true.
it
Even
doesn't,
though
but it
they
doesn't. The
signed a
recognition
piece
from
of paper.
Palestine isn't doing anything for.
You're
Hamas totally rejects.
I'm not talking about Hamas.
Hamas is the majority among the Palestinian people. They won the elections in 2006.
They won a majority of the seats.
Yes,
They
exactly.
didn't win a majority
every
of the votes.
opinion poll today says the majority of Palestinians
that sounds
support
right.
the Hamas.
That sounds
and the
right.
Hamas absolutely rejects Israel.
But-
so if Arafat in 2003, 1993 or whatever issued a sort of recognition,
It wasn't
of
a
Israel,
sort of recognition.
Okay, a
It was a-
recognition of Israel. It's meaningless. It's meaningless.
It's meaningless.
And anyhow, I don't believe that Arafat was sincere about it.
Does it matter what you or I think
Well,
about
most
what you
Israelis
felt?
do, and that does matter.
Okay,
That does matter. But Hamas says no, and Hamas is the majority
So
today.
for years,
So-
for years, the Israeli and U.S. demand was that the Palestinians recognize 242 and 338. They did, but you're saying Okay, we demanded that they do this, but it was meaningless when they did it.
'Cause it was-
Then the demand was
It was a
that
tactical thing, yes.
then the demand was that the PLO recognize Israel.
Tactical.
Okay, we demanded that they
Yeah.
did this, and they did it,
Yeah.
but it's meaningless.
And they never changed their charter, the PLO. You may remember that.
In fact, in
They supposedly abrogated the old charter, but never came up with a new one.
no,
so
but,
there's no new charter.
but in 1996,
And Farouk Kaddoumi said, of course, the old charter is still in force. Yes.
yes. But the point is,
Did they do a chart? There's no way. I thought the PLO did the right thing with the charter because it was a formal thing. Did they do a charter scam as well? Oh no. Man, this is a problem. Charter fraud. It's such a good tactic. I'm gonna get a charter. I'm gonna cause so much damage with it to negotiations with other people.
the Palestinians' demands are constantly
Not
made.
the trees. No, that's Hamas. It's on the PLO charter. I think the PLO charter had initially said like don't recognize Israel. It's not a real thing, and also that any Jew who arrived after 1917 was part of the Zionist invasion, and they won't be like equal citizens and shit. Yeah. Are you a victim of charter fraud?
made of them. And when
And
they
of Israel, no?
and when they accede to those demands, they're then told actually what you did is meaningless. So here's a new set of demands. I mean, it's like a
There's
hamster.
no new set of demands.
It's like a hamster.
Let me
It's like a hamster
let me tell
stuck
you what.
in a
No,
wheel
let me tell you what
that
the
will be
bottom
told
line
if you
is.
run
The bottom
fast
line-
enough, you'll get out of the cage.
No, the bottom line is that Israel would like a Palestinian Sadat. It wants the Palestinians.
I would-
Listen,
This
just
is
let me
really
finish.
a worst case scenario.
Okay,
you're
let me
talking
just
about
because
now.
they shot Sadat. But anyhow,
For
the
good reason.
Israelis want
For good reason?
want the Palestinians. Israelis want the Palestinians to
Did he say for good reason they shot Sadat? Oh no. Okay.
actually accept
There's no.
a Palestinian Sadat. It wants the Palestinians.
I would-
Listen,
This
just
is
let me
really a
finish.
worst case scenario.
Okay,
you're
let me
talking
just
about
because
now.
they shot Sadat. But anyhow,
For
the
good reason.
Israelis
For good reason?
want the Palestinians. Israelis want the Palestinians to actually accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel and the Zionist project, and then live side by side with them in two states. That's what the Israelis. I don't even know. If
And
it's
what
true.
is the
I don't
formal
even know if that's
position?
true today.
And what is the
because it may
formal
be-
position of this Israeli government?
No, I'm saying I don't know if it exists
Okay,
today.
it's
because I'm
predecessor
talking about
and its
I'm
predecessor
talking
and its
about-
predecessor. Come on.
That's what Israelis want. They want
Professor
a
Morris,
change of,
Moeen has-
psyche among the Palestinians.
Moeen has an
And if that doesn't
interesting-
happen, there won't be a Palestinian state.
Moeen,
There just won't
Professor
be.
Morris, Moeen has an interesting point.
Forget international
because
law
I
and all the
found,
UN
I found,
resolutions.
I know you want to forget it, just like you want to forget the genocide charge. I know you want to forget that.
Well, the
And you
Palestinians want to forget it too, and it doesn't suit them as well, right?
But here's the problem, and it's exactly the problem that Moeen just brought up. Now, I read carefully your book, One State, Two States. With all due respect, absolutely a disgrace. Coming from you.
Most reviewers didn't agree with you.
How many times did he read it though?
Yeah, coming from you was like you wrote it in your sleep. It's nothing compared to what you wrote before. I don't know why you did it. In my opinion, you ruined your reputation. Not totally, but you undermined it with that book. But let's get
How is Norman? Okay. That's all right.
to
whatever.
the issue that Moeen wrote.
The public relations
Here's what
advisor
you said.
himself.
You said formally, yes, it's true. The Palestinians recognize Israel. But then you said viscerally, in their hearts,
They don't.
they didn't really recognize Israel. So I thought to myself, how does Professor Morris
open your
know?
chest.
No, what's in the hearts of Palestinians? I don't know. I was
don't accept Israel's legitimacy.
I was surprised as a historian you would be talking about what's lurking in the hearts of Palestinians. But then you said something which was really interesting. You said even if in their hearts they accepted Israel, you said, quote, rationally they could never accept Israel because they got nothing. They had this beautiful Palestine, and now they're reduced to just a few parcels of land.
So
The
they will
two-state
never
settlement.
accept it.
So yes, so you
This is
said
true.
there's no way they can accept
No,
it.
I would say that as well.
Yeah,
The
so-
two-state solution, as proposed,
Everything
doesn't make any sense.
exactly as Moeen said. You keep moving.
I've heard him say that as well. It's like he said he completely understands why like it makes sense for Palestinians to reject two states, but then the problem is well, what the fuck do we do now?
The goalposts.
No.
Until we reach the point where we realize, according to Benny Morris, there can't be a solution. So
said
why don't you just
maybe
say
with
that
a-
outright?
maybe-
Why don't you say it outright? That according to you, the
He said I've seen him do interviews where he says there is no solution. Like I'm pretty sure he says that. Yeah.
Palestinians can never be reasonable because according to you,
They want all of Palestine.
according to
That's
you, they couldn't possibly They couldn't possibly agree to a two-state settlement because it's such a lousy settlement.
Because
That's
they
what
want
you
all of
said.
Palestine.
But you said rationally they couldn't accept it, not their feelings.
It's both.
You said rational. You went from formally, viscerally, rationally. So now
What's your metric for what's a reasonable peace deal and how do we invoke international law? Well, first of all, the two sides need to agree on something. As for the laws, I think you can appeal to the resolutions as they're lined out. You just have to recognize that they are not like hard rules. Like they're not even written as hard rules. Right of return is a bit more specific with the whole like return to your home kind of thing. But every Palestinian negotiator who's ever spoken to an Israeli negotiator has accepted that. That's why they talk about 194 as like they'll often say we want a recognition, and then implementation will recognize the demographic concerns of Israel, and most people probably go back to, because it'd be a right of return to Palestine, mostly in West Bank and Gaza. So that's not unfeasible. As for 242, same thing. It's like withdrawal from occupied territory. Okay, well, what's the situation on the ground? Where are there settlements which ones can be uprooted realistically, which ones are a bit too big or a bit too permanent, what land can be swapped from the West Bank or from or near the Negev and near Gaza. Yeah, I think these resolutions can be used as guidelines. And as for security, like 338, 242, like that, then how can this statehood be implemented that assures the security of both sides? It's okay.
we're reaching the
Surely settlements being illegal means we want to remove as many as possible. Yeah, of course, I would say remove as many as possible. Definitely all the outposts. And as for the rest of them, whichever ones can be moved. And especially the ones that are in areas that are detrimental to Palestinian state contiguity, because that's a big thing as well. Like the West Bank has to be contiguous. The ones along the border are not a big deal because you can just land swap it. But the ones that are deeper in, that cut off Palestinian communities, they're a massive problem.
point where, according to Benny Morris, the Palestinians can't be reasonable because reasonably they have to reject two states.
They want all of
Louise
Palestine.
is absolutely correct. There's no
Is
way.
it unreasonable to want all of the West Bank? It's not unreasonable. The settlements were a massive mistake and they were a really immoral and horrible thing to do. The fact is they've happened and no one is realistically thinking that 700,000 Israeli settlers are going to be pushed over into Israel as part of a peace agreement. I don't know. It's not realistic. You could do it through war, but you're taking the chance there.
Way to resolve the problem,
They
according to
want
your
all of
logic.
Palestine. He said that himself. He said they should dismantle Israel. That's what he said.
What I said.
You didn't say that.
Dismantle Israel.
What I said, and I've written.
I'm glad you didn't deny it.
I've written extensively on this issue on why a two-state settlement is still feasible, and I came out in support of that proposition. Perhaps in my heart, you can see that I was just bullshit, but that's what I actually wrote.
Bullshit.
That was a number of years ago, and just as a matter of historical record, beginning in the early 1970s, there was fierce debate within the Palestinian national movement about whether to accept or reject. And there were three schools of thought. There was one that would accept nothing less than the total liberation of Palestine. There was a second that accepted what was called the establishment of a fighting national authority on Palestinian soil, which they saw as a springboard for the total liberation of Palestine. And there was a third school that believed that under current dynamics and so on, that they should go for a two-state settlement. And our friend and correspondent, Kauter Loerse, has written a very perceptive article on when the PLO, already in 1976, came out in open support of a two-state resolution at the Security Council. PLO accepted it. Israel, of course, rejected it. But the resolution didn't pass because the US and the UK vetoed it. It was both of them.
I think it was 9-5.
Okay. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that the PLO came to accept a two-state settlement. Why they did it, I think, is irrelevant. And subsequently, the PLO acted on the basis of seeking to achieve a two-state settlement. The reason I think, and I think, Norm, you've written about this, the reason that Arafat was so insistent on getting minimally acceptable terms for a two-state settlement at Camp David and afterwards was precisely because he knew that once he signed, that was all the Palestinians were going to get. If his intention had been, I'm not accepting Israel, I simply want to springboard, he would have accepted a Palestinian state in Jericho.
I think that's actually a good argument. I don't know why. If people think that Arafat was just hell-bent on refusing everything so that he could just keep on fighting, I do wonder why he didn't just take Camp David and then just use it to build tunnels and covertly militarize and launch an attack on Israel. I don't know. I think it's a better explanation is just that he genuinely thought he could get a better version of two states by fighting more. I don't know. Could be wrong.
But he didn't. He
That's
insisted.
something I've never understood. He should have logically accepted the springboard and then from there
No,
launched
he
his next stage.
understood. He didn't understand. He
should have done
understood
that.
international
you're
law would put a real constraint on him.
No, but
once
also,
he
I
accepted,
think
it was over.
constitutionally, he was incapable of signing.
Well,
That's-
I don't know that.
Like Arafat would be bound by international law. The guy's a terrorist. What are you talking about? Okay.
If
You're
that's
right. That he
I'm not
should
his
have, he should have
advocate.
accepted it.
But if you're correct,
Yeah.
okay, that he was really out
For
to
all of
eliminate
Palestine.
Israel, then he wouldn't have cared about the borders. He wouldn't have cared about what the thing said about refugees. He would have gotten a sovereign state and used that to achieve that
The
purpose.
springboard.
But I think it was precisely because he recognized that he was not negotiating for a springboard. He was negotiating permanent status, that he was such a stickler about
he
the
wasn't-
details. The second,
Just as a factual matter, he wasn't such a stickler. When they asked him
He
how
was
many
a horrible negotiator, though. Like, God.
refugees,
So was Mandela. Dry heat. I'm going to give you one chance to explain why I would say that's a bad comparison. Or maybe I'll just tell you and see if you acknowledge it. Mandela didn't target civilians. He didn't have a policy of targeting civilians. Actually, the ANC spoke out against people within their movement who targeted civilians. Mandela's approach to Mandela did not necklace people. His wife did, you fucking uninformed shithead. Mandela was not his wife. They were different people. The ANC distanced themselves from his wife's actions. We can look over Mandela's statements on violence. His policy, his directive, was targeting infrastructure. How many civilians died during the apartheid fighting? Like between the 80s and 90s, it was like 70 civilians. Now you're pivoting to saying they did some violence against civilians. Okay, no one's disputing that. It's whether or not they targeted civilians. And now you're pivoting back to he was a terrorist. You're so dumb. You're like all the rest of them. How many times have I had this conversation on my stream? Mandela was a terrorist. Yeah, but he didn't target civilians in the same way that like Hamas or the PLO did in the 70s, right? Oh, but they killed some civilians. Obviously not the same fucking way. They didn't have like a general like policy or a generally accepted course of action, which was to target civilians. Oh, but they were still terrorists. Like, what the fuck is wrong with your brain? It was normally other black people getting necklaced, yes. Suspected collaborators were the ones who mostly got necklaced. Oh, Jesus. Again, necklacing was not endorsed by the mainstream of the ANC. They distanced themselves from people who did necklacing. We're going in a circle now. We're actually on a fucking merry-go-round. I need a Mandela command. I do. Oh, God. The people who called Mandela terrorists were like right-wing apartheid supporters. I don't know. Okay. Should we read Mandela's court statements about his approach to violence and see if you think it's comparable to the 60s and 70s PLO? Celebrate his willingness to use violence against infrastructure. Yes. It's not my fault you don't know the difference. You're just, or I think I know what's happening is I think people have these talking points and they don't really know what's underneath them. So they just kind of repeat them uncritically and they think it's a really good point. But once they realize that it doesn't really work as an analogy to the PLO or Hamas, they just get kind of stuck for a bit. It's like there's like 5 stages of grief going on right now when Dry Heat realizes that his Mandela comparison to Hamas and the PLO is horseshit. Anyway.
the numbers.
It was a principle rather than the numbers.
principle.
He said I would be pragmatic about it.
Yes, and the numbers that were used at Annapolis were between 100 and 250,000 refugees over 10 years. That was the number. Arafat, when he was asked at Camp David, he kept saying, I care about the Lebanese, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, which came to about 300,000, which was a large concession from, whether you accept the number or not, that he wasn't talking about 6 million. He was talking about between 100 and 250,000 over 10 years. Now, the best offer that came from the Palestinians, the best offer that came from Israel was the Olmert offer.
Can we just pretend like we didn't all lay out the exceptionally pessimistic view?
Well, sorry, I know people. Conrad, you're saying. I don't think Dry Heat is saying. I think he's saying one man's terrorist and another man's freedom fighter. No, that's not what he's saying. What he's doing is he's trying to say that the dismissals of Hamas and PLO as terrorists is obviously like a negative connotation, but by saying Mandela was also a terrorist, well, everyone likes Mandela. So if you like Mandela as a terrorist, well, we can obviously accept people like the PLO and Hamas as well. It's to soften the claim of terrorism against people like the PLO and Hamas by comparing them to Mandela. It's to try and say that like just being a terrorist isn't like a bad thing, which is, you could make that argument. But again, the terrorism of people like the PLO and Hamas was targeting civilians. Was for the PLO more so and is still for Hamas. Like the ANC didn't have this kind of trend, even when violence was getting quite bad in South Africa. It's not like the ANC was on the bi-weekly, on the fortnightly, just going into densely populated areas of white people and blowing themselves up and taking out like between sort of 5 and 50 people with them. It's just a dumb argument. It's a dumb argument that uncritical Reddit headline reading shitheads use to try and score points, and they don't really understand how ridiculous the analogy they're making is. But anyway,
Of a two-state, hold on a second, two-state solution. Let's pretend that in 5 years and 10 years, a two-state peace settlement is reached. And as historians, you'll still be here and writing about it.
And now they're like desperately trying to get me to Google stuff because they think it's going to change the position that the ANC killed like 70 or 80 people in the space of over a decade and are just in no way comparable to the PLO and Hamas with respect to their approach to targeting civilians.
Unfortunately, the record proves that the Palestinian side is delusional. The longer that the conflict endures, the worse position they'll be in. But for some reason...
To be fair, I'm only doing this because I was supposed to be going to Edinburgh today, which would have cost me like just under £100 for the train return and maybe 100 because I had to stay in a hotel. So, I'm just... And for food, eating out when I'm there, so and drinks, so chill.
They've never had a leader that convinced them of that as much. That Arafat thought that if he held on, there was always a better deal around the corner. Abbas is more concerned with trying to maintain any legitimacy amongst Palestinians than actually trying to negotiate anything realistic with Israel. That Palestinians are always incentivized to feel like as long as they keep fighting, either the international community is going to save them with the 5 millionth UN resolution condemning whatever, that another ICJ advisory opinion is finally going to lead to the expulsion of 500,000 Jews from the West Bank, or that some other international body, the ICJ and the genocide judge, is going to come and save the Palestinians. As long as they, in their mind, feel like somebody is coming to save them, then they feel like they're going to have the ability to get something better in the future. But the reality is all of the good partners for peace that the Palestinians have completely and utterly abandoned them. Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, whether you're talking bilateral peace or the Abraham Accords, most of the Arab leaders in negotiating peace with Israel have just not had as much of an interest in maintaining the rights and the representations of what the Palestinian people want. And the only people they have today to draw legitimacy from or to have on their side to argue with them are people that, I guess, write books or tweet, or people in the international community that do resolutions or Amnesty International reports. And the reality is we can scream until we're blue in the face on these things. None of it has gotten any closer to helping the Palestinians in any sense of the word. The condition has only gotten worse. The settlements only continue to expand. The military operations are only to get more brutal. The blockade is going to continue to have worse effects. As long as we use international law as the basis, and there isn't a strong, Sadat-like Palestinian leader that's willing to come up and confront Israel with the brave, peaceful negotiations to force them to acquiesce, nothing is going to happen. And I think that the issue you come up with is, whether it's people like Norm that talk about how brave the October 7th attacks were, or how much respect they have for those fighters, the Israel, in a way, and I think people have said as much about Netanyahu, the right wants violence from the Palestinians because it always gives them a perpetual excuse to further the conflict. Well, we have to go in October 7th, we've got to remove Hamas. Well, we can't trust these people in the West. We have to do the night raids because, the second intifada, it made us feel like the Palestinian people didn't want trust with us. I feel like the biggest thing that would force Israel to change its path would be a real, not for like 2 weeks, but an actual peaceful Palestinian leader, somebody committed to peace that is able to apply those standards and hold the entire region of Palestine to those standards. Because I think over time, the mounting pressure from without the international community and the mounting pressure from within, because Israel hosts a lot of its own criticism. If we talk about Bet Salem, we talk about Haaretz, like Israel will host a lot of its own criticism. I think that pressure would force Israel towards an actual peace agreement, but it's never going to come through violence. Historically, it hasn't. And in the modern day, violence has just hurt the Palestinians more and more.
If you paint a picture of the future, now is a good moment
that was very
for both
fast,
Palestine and Israel to get new leadership.
Bongello.
Netanyahu's on the way out. Hamas possibly is on the way out. Who should rise to the top such that a peaceful settlement can be reached?
The problem is, like Benny said, it's difficult because Hamas enjoys so much widespread support amongst the Palestinian people. I think that I don't know, there's opinions on whether democracy or pushing them towards elections was the right or wrong idea. But with like an Islamic fundamentalist government for Hamas, I don't know if a negotiation with Israel ever happens there. And then when the international pressure is always, 67 borders, infinite right of return for refugees, and a total withdrawal of Israel from all these lands to even start negotiations, I just don't see realistically on the Palestinian side, no negotiation.
Oh, yeah, that is Hamas's, that's Hamas's peace position.
Are ever going to start in a place that Israel's willing to accept.
If you want to dismiss international law, that's fine, but then you have to do it consistently. You can't set standards for the Palestinians, but reject applying those standards to Israel. If we're going to have the law of the jungle, then we can all be beasts, and not only some of us. And I think
Well,
so.
it's more, yeah, that would basically play into the Israeli right, though, because the problem is that law of the jungle means all the Palestinians get thrown out to Jordan and Egypt and Syria, and then Israel takes it all. That's the law of the jungle, unfortunately. I don't buy throwing out international law, though. I think the principles of the resolutions actually work. But people just dishonestly frame them as people dishonestly represent these resolutions into saying things that they actually don't. Like when Finkelstein has to just invent reasons to believe that there's some binding law out there that says Israel has to withdraw from every square foot of territory behind the Green Line. But that's just not true. That's not written. That's not a law. It's just not. He just made it up. And he cites incredibly dense documents that no one will read to say where they are, but they're not there. 194 is more complicated because technically, legally, the refugees of 48 do have a right to return, even if it's generational, because right of return, I think, is generational. Refugee status isn't. I think that's how it works. But the problem is that generally, refugee groups just never use that right because they go somewhere else and they become citizens there. Like the Muslims who lived in India or the Hindus who lived in Pakistan who swapped over the border in 47. They probably, a lot of those people do still have a right of return. They're never going to use it. But that's probably why that particular one would just have, it has to be negotiated. It's the only way. Isn't violent acquisition of land illegal? So shouldn't they just withdraw everywhere? That's, again, it's a principle. The problem is violent acquisition of land from who, and who should it go back to? Because it wasn't acquisition from the Palestinians, it was acquisition from Jordan and Egypt. And who it goes, so unilateral withdrawal, that's why the resolution was drafted in the way that it was, because a unilateral withdrawal wouldn't have made sense. So yeah, unfortunately there are some, it's a bit complex. International law and all this stuff is very complex.
It's either that or you have certain agreed standards that are intended to regulate our conduct, all of our conduct, not just some of us.
Well,
so that's a
I'm
fundamental.
saying to abandon.
Well, you're saying, international law and the millionth UN resolution, you're being very dismissive about all these things. And that's fine, but then you have to be dismissive
saying, like, for instance, like
across the board.
That was a Chapter 6 resolution. That's a non-binding. But 242 is
binding.
What is,
of course it's
absolutely
binding.
not.
What is binding? Do you know anything about how the UN system
binding,
works?
if you read the language of the resolution, binding is typically if it commits you to upholding a particular international law or if it
What
establishes
is
a new
Chapter
law.
6? You just throw out words. You hear binding,
Does
not
242
binding.
even does 242 mention a Palestinian state?
No,
Norm.
Of course
that's
not.
part of the
Okay,
problem.
then
That
yes,
was the
of
reason
course
why the
not.
Palestinians didn't want to recognize 242 because it only referred at the very end.
Sure,
to
but
a
the PLO
refugee
recognized
problem.
181 and 242. When they
Yeah,
made
but
their
hold on,
original-
hold on. Every United Nations Security Council resolution, irrespective of under which chapter it was adopted, is by definition binding. Binding not only on the members of the Security Council, but on every member state of the UN. Read the UN Charter. It's black and white.
Sure, people
Okay.
can look that
Now
up,
regarding
but
yes,
the language even of 242 is kept intentionally vague, such that it doesn't actually provide again the
it's
final
actually
contours.
not that vague
It's
because
incredibly
the term length
It's vague. It's deliberately vague. The drafters made it vague for
peace originates
Also, I don't know. Okay, sorry.
in 242.
Sure,
the
but
idea
part about
is
territorial acquisition and Israel's need to give it
Okay.
up was kept vague.
Okay,
That's why in
but
70. That's why
I
in
just-
79
you
Israel
asked-
saw that
you
they
asked a
fulfilled their
separate
obligations under
Allow me
242 in
points
terms
of
of withdraw.
information. Allow me points of information.
Yeah.
The first principle in UN Resolution 242 is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force.
But are we going to talk about? Fuck me.
Which is
That
meaningless.
It's a
It may be
principle.
meaningless to you, Mr.
was
Bonnell.
meaningless to everyone in
Okay,
the region.
Mr. Bonnell, that principle was adopted by the Friendly Nations Resolution, the UN General Assembly in 1970. That resolution was then reiterated in the International Court of Justice, this ruling, advisory opinion in 2000.
That's why he thinks 2004. That's why he thinks in 2004 they said that Israel should withdraw from everything behind the Green Line. Because they reiterated 242 and he doesn't understand 242. Okay. They say it's a principle. Okay.
That was the basis of the coalition against Iraq when it acquired Kuwait and then declared it a province of Kuwait.
Yep, which
That
Arafat
is-
supported.
That's what's called. That's
True.
called
Arafat
Arafat did support it.
Arafat did
That's
support
why
it.
it was a shitty deal with Yassou,
it's
of
not
course.
accurate. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there.
It's not accurate that Arafat endorsed.
Okay, I'm not going to.
Oh, he's what I've heard people say this before, that they don't think Arafat explicitly supported Saddam. I never looked into it. I'm pretty sure he did, but okay.
Go there.
Okay.
It's
Palestinian
called under
parliament.
international law, use Kogan's or peremptory norms of international law, the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. That is not controversial. It's not vague. You couldn't put it more succinctly. You cannot acquire territory by force under international law.
On the
But how you give it back, how they were supposed to give it back was written vaguely. Come on. Go on.
That is
before 67. Who owns the Gaza Strip before 67?
Mr. Bennell, don't change the subject. If you don't know what you're talking
It's not
about,
about
at least
changing.
have the
I'm curious.
at least
How
have the
close is
humility.
242?
You talk
How
about
close
chapter
is
6.
242
You don't know
gotten?
chapter
How
6.
close has
Lord
242
Biden
gotten to
is
the
fucking
Palestinian
thinking
peace?
From tweet 5. You have no idea what you're talking about. It's just so embarrassing. At least have some humility. Between us, we're
He's saying this about something he's wrong about, though. He's wrong about the clarity of 242. He's just interpreted it in his own way. The people who drafted the resolution disagree with him. The resolution neither commands nor prohibits total withdrawal. If the resolution is ambiguous and purposely so on this crucial issue, how is the withdrawal issue to be settled? By direct negotiations between concerned parties. This is one of the resolution's drafters. This viral clip is him being wrong? Okay. What the Sorry, we'll get it from a non-Wikipedia page, because apparently if something on Wikipedia, it must be fake. I don't know. This is him at the Security Council. Or should we go to the UN website itself? Maybe we'll do that. I will not rest until... There's no way anyone disagrees with this, right? Why the fuck would they word it in that way? It's so funny that this was the viral clip, but Finkelstein was... he was wrong about 242. Okay, but now we know why he says the thing he says about 2004. Because they referenced 242. Okay, and he doesn't understand 242. Oh well. Is this by the guy who, in 2011, this is actually the guy who drafted it, talking about it. But I don't think I'm going to get this because it's from a journal. Oh no, and I don't have my VPN right now. Whoops. Ugh. All right.
read maybe 10,000 books on the topic, and you've read 2 Wikipedia entries, and you start talking about Chapter 6. Do you know what Chapter 7 is?
Answer me.
Do you know what Chapter 7 is?
Answer me a question. How close has 242 gotten the Palestinians to a state?
You know,
How
me
close has
answer
the
that.
2004 advisory opinion gotten the West Bank settlement?
What's your alternative?
The alternative is not this, whatever this making money off the conflict is. The actual alternative.
money.
The actual
That's the
alternative.
you should talk about making money off
your
of
media blitz
idiocy.
where you go and talk to 50 million different people about
your
your
earlier
awesome
point.
But he has a point there.
The issue is you have
All
to
these
negotiate.
resolutions have gotten the Palestinians no
Nothing.
closer
Yeah, but hold on
to
a
a
second.
state.
Because they haven't
Your
been
earlier-
enforced because of the U.S. veto.
They're not going to be enforced.
Well,
wait.
okay.
Nowhere.
If I may,
You know,
I'm gonna enforce the ICC
you know
doesn't even
what?
enforce
You
the
know what,
mechanism.
Professor
We're
Morris?
talking about the case for genocide.
Professor Morris, because of your logic, and I'm not disputing it, that's why October 7th happened.
Oh my God.
Because there was no options left for those people. Exactly what
And
Moeen
now
said.
what options are left? After
You know,
October
This has
7th,
been
They just had to target kibbutzim and strip a bunch of dead wifeys. Bro.
What's stopped
The only option is conflict.
listen to this.
The only option is
Mr. Bonnell
combat.
is now an expert on Palestinian
Hold on.
mentality.
You're contradicting
You know about
yourself.
I only
Palestinian
deal with
mentality,
facts.
and
I
you
only
know
deal with
about
Oh, it's
Chapter
unhinged.
5.
Egypt didn't find it
Tell me about
necessary.
Chapter 5.
Egypt
Tell
didn't
me
find
about
it
Chapter
necessary
5.
to negotiate
But you're
peace with the
con- hold on a
Palestinians.
second.
Jordan didn't find it necessary to
Hey,
negotiate peace with the
if I
Palestinians. The
may,
Abraham Accords didn't
you're
include the
contradicting-
Palestinians.
Walk faster.
Despite all of the
Faster.
international law.
Everybody,
Wait,
Faster.
you're contradicting yourself. On the one hand, you're saying all the Palestinians do is fight and violence and terrorism and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, you're saying they're expecting salvation from UN resolutions and international courts. Those aren't violent.
No, but it's part of maintaining. It's the continual putting off of negotiating
They've
any
neg-
solution.
They've negotiated.
As in when Arafat
I
takes
think he
10
said
days to respond, when Arafat takes 10 days to respond, comes and all over the world to go and visit his friends. Yes,
I
but
think Moeen
putting the
said
conflict off
they accepted
indefinitely.
2 states in 1975. brace
They
yourself.
Why didn't they accept the Taba
Brace
Summit then?
yourself.
No, this
That's
is-
50
this is
years
the
ago.
This is
That's a
alleged.
half century
there's
ago.
a
No,
very-
no, they
there's a
didn't
ver-
accept the two-state
He
solution.
called
Just
it
a
a very
moment,
good
please.
article.
There's-
He's
You
quite
can quote
right.
Arafat talking about how he's lying and he's just going to use in 94 and in 95 when he's making trips around the world, how he
there's
just
a
wants to
very
use this as the
rich-
Faster,
starting
talk
ground.
faster,
I'm
talk
sorry, I can
faster.
also, you can watch YouTube video and
There's
slow
a
down to
very-
0.5 speed if you don't understand what I'm saying.
There's a very
Oh, no.
there's a very lengthy history
Mhm.
of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. You want to deny that those negotiations
Norman's heart rate is blasting. Look how heavily he's breathing.
took place?
Where it feels like there was a good
What
faith
feels
effort
like-
where
He's having to restrain himself from from trying to get Destiny deported. Oh no. He's recalling the phone number for Child Protective Services for Stephen's son.
there was a good faith
Feels
effort,
like-
where it was a good
We
faith
have a
effort.
written record.
With all due respect,
We have a written
Mr.
record,
Pop
Mr.
Historian, you
Burrell.
can't even read the written records. I don't know why you're referring to
Excuse
it. Okay?
me? I
There's-
just said there
there's-
are 15,000 pages on Annapolis.
And I'm sure you cherry-picked your favorite quotes
I
from
don't
all of
cherry
them,
pick.
okay?
Hey,
That's
at
great.
least-
Uh-oh.
That's
Mr.
great.
Burrell, at
Yeah.
least I had a quote to cherry
That's
pick.
great.
All you have
and I
is
can-
Wikipedia.
you want me- I gave you quotes.
All you
I
have
can
is
give you quotes. Do you want
Wikipedia.
quotes? Find me the information
I
that shows
think-
the Palestinian cause has been furthered by any international
the
law. You
prob-
can't do it.
I think the problem is different. Okay, you want to say the Palestinians.
I think the problem is they're lending too much credence to Finkelstein's interpretation of international law. That's a big problem. Like Finkelstein is not correct about the law. But okay, this is all right. This is a good last
They're only
half
fighting,
hour.
and then when I point out they've also gone to the court and the UN and say, well, all they do then is these things, and you say they should be negotiating, and I demonstrate that there was a lengthy record of negotiations. Said, yeah, but they didn't go in good faith. Again, you're placing the hamster in the wheel and telling him if he runs fast enough, maybe one day he'll get out of the cage.
What was the best good
Okay,
faith
and please,
negotiations on the side
if
of
I
the...
could just finish. I think the fundamental problem here is not what the Palestinians have and haven't done. And it's perfectly legitimate to have a discussion about whether they could have been more effective. Of course they could have been more effective. Everyone could have always been more effective. The fundamental issue here is that Israel has never been prepared to concede the legitimacy of Palestinian national rights in the land of the former British Mandate of Palestine.
Then how do you explain Taba Summit? How do you explain the
No,
Camp
Barak
David?
and Olmert did
How do you
did
explain
accept the
Olmert's offer to
legitimacy
Hamas? Yeah.
of Palestinian demands. This is,
Well,
but
those-
they just didn't want to give the Palestinians all of Palestine. That's all.
No, all of Palestine.
All of Palestine.
You mean all of the
No,
occupied
no,
territories?
no.
You're talking about all of Palestine.
Wait,
being
what is the
occupied
occupied?
territory.
What is the
I'm
occupied
talking
territories?
Morris.
The occupied
Is that
territories.
all of Israel?
The
Professor
occupied
Morris, could you
territories
show
are
me-
those territories that Israel occupied in June of
Could you
1967.
show me-
Palestinians often
could
use
you show
that
me-
term to define
Okay.
the whole of
Could you
Palestine,
show me-
not just the West Bank.
Could you show
those-
me, Professor Morris, in all the negotiations, and all
All
the
of them.
accounts that have been written, can you show me one where the Palestinians in the negotiations, because that's what we were talking about, wanted all of Israel? The maximum
They can't say that because international
also,
community
you know it.
won't accept
You
it.
know it 'cause
So
you
they
know
didn't
what-
say it, they
you know-
didn't ask
but you
for
know
it.
what-
Yeah, I don't know if that's the best explanation. Like, anyway.
No,
What's in their
Hamas
heart?
did.
Yeah.
Hamas always said
Hamas never,
all of it.
Hamas only
Yeah,
negotiated
Hamas were rejectionists. Of course they did, but yeah.
with Israel about prisoner exchanges. And
Yeah,
the
no, I know,
blockade.
So
but
we
they
were talking
represent
about
a lot of the Palestinian people. You'll agree.
The only place I saw pieces of Israel were the land swaps. And the land swaps accounted for about 2 to 5% of Israel.
I don't get this argument about the Olmert one being like a missed opportunity, because how the fuck would that have worked? Like, let's say Abbas accepts it, but Hamas are in Gaza. What are they going to do? Like, coup them for a Palestinian state? I have no idea how that was supposed to work. Would it be a unity government? Like, after Hamas had just thrown Fatah guys over buildings because Fatah tried to coup them? I don't know. I don't think that makes any sense. Taba was a missed opportunity, though. Like, Arafat, I don't know what the he was smoking during that whole period, but yeah. I think that was inexcusable.
Nobody asked for all of Israel. Why
What do you mean? They asked for all of Israel in 48. They asked for all of Israel in 67. What do you think those words were about? You're not going to respond to anything I'm saying because you have no
I'll
answer.
respond to you.
That's correct.
Okay,
yeah.
Mr. Benel.
Mr. Benet.
We were talking about the diplomatic negotiations beginning with 2000,
Yes, I'm saying, but
2001.
you can't pretend that
He
the first
went
ask
back-
for
he
Israel
went-
was in diplomacy.
Okay.
It was through war.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Is the international law argument ever going to get the Palestinians closer to state? Is the Israeli state ever going to be dismantled? Do you think that's like realistic coming up ever in the next 20 years?
Again, I'm posing a question, and the question is, regardless of what's feasible or realistic today, the question I'm posing is: can you have peace in the Middle East with this militant, irrational, genocidal, apartheid state
Oh
and
my
power?
God.
Honestly, I don't think so, no.
Such a thought-terminating horse.
Okay, and genocidal in the Middle East with this militant, irrational,
What's he saying? here?
genocidal, apartheid state in power.
Hamas, I don't think so, no.
Okay.
Oh, he said
And the
Hamas.
question I'm asking is, can you have peace with this regime,
Uh-oh.
or does this regime and its institutions
Did he not hear him say
need to be
Hamas?
dismantled, similar to what the examples I gave of,
Yeah.
of Europe and Southern Africa?
How do you contend with the fact that most of the surrounding Arab states seem to agree that you can?
Yeah, you're correct. Several of them, most importantly Egypt, Jordan, have made their peace with Israel. I should add that Israel's conduct since
Nah,
then.
the Muin haters are fucking wrong. Okay, because he's making concessions and like saying like, yeah, you're right. I don't feel like a determined like hack propagandist would do that. Like I think he's wrong on things, but I don't think he's like a. I think the conversation would be so much better if Muin had someone other than Finkelstein with him. Even Pape, he'd have been better for this. Less entertaining though.
Has placed these relations under strain. I had very little. I didn't take the reports of a Saudi-Israeli rapprochement particularly seriously before October 7th. The reason being that it was really a Saudi-Israeli-U.S. deal, which committed the U.S. To make certain commitments to Saudi Arabia that would probably never get through Congress.
Do you not consider the Egypt-Israeli peace deal legitimate then, since the United States made a great financial contribution to Egypt?
I don't think the question is whether that deal is legitimate or not. I think that deal exists, but the point is whether the core of this conflict is not between Israel and Egypt. The core of this conflict is between Israel and the Palestinian people, and the reason that Israel agreed to relinquish the occupied Egyptian Sinai, and the reason that Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty was signed in 1979 is because Israel in 1973 recognized that its military superiority was ultimately no match for Egypt's determination to recover its occupied territories, and that there would come a point when Egypt would find a way to extract an unbearable
Maybe
price.
just the Israelis wanted peace.
Well, the Israelis
Not
wanted,
just because they were afraid of what Egypt might do at some
if you're
point.
talking about the average Israeli citizen, I think that's a fair characterization. If you're talking about the Israeli leadership, I think they looked at it in more strategic terms. How do you remove the most powerful Arab military?
I get some whiz kid to get me this book. I'm looking for this book because I want to read. I think I might want to read as much of it as I can, because the guy one of the guys who drafted Resolution 242 and gave that opinion on it being deliberately vague even wrote a book called UN Security Council Resolution 242, a case study in diplomatic ambiguity. Like,
2 points, simple points.
I know Finkelstein's read it so many times, but author Lord Caradon.
What was the terms of that Egypt-Israel peace treaty? International law. Egypt demanded
Nobody cared about international law.
allow me to finish. Every single inch
Nobody
of Egyptian...
talked about international law. Begin and Carter and Saddam talked about the reality.
No,
Israel occupying territory.
Professor Morris, I know the record. They demanded, as you know, because you've written about it, they demanded every square inch, as you know. They demanded the oil fields be dismantled.
No, that's in the
airfields.
No, not dismantled. They wanted the oil fields.
And they wanted the settlements dismantled.
The
settlements, the oil fields, and the airfield. They demanded all three back. You can't have.
What do you mean back? The airfields weren't there when the Egyptians were there.
That's incorrect.
You're
incorrect. They built an airfield. The Israelis built an airfield in the occupied Sinai, and they wanted it back.
They didn't want it back. It wasn't theirs.
No, okay.
They wanted the territory in which the airfield Israel had built back.
The oil fields, the airfields, the settlements had to be dismantled.
Yes.
Begin said, "I don't want to be the first prime minister to dismantle a settlement," but he did. Why? Because of the law.
No, it was because of peace. It was normalization
of the law. The law had nothing to do with anything. It was a negotiation.
Begin a law guy all of a sudden.
Two states, each of which wanted certain
Palestinians
things. The law had nothing to do with anything.
As I said repeatedly in the negotiations.
You're not listening.
I know.
You're missing my point.
I've read the negotiations.
The law has nothing to do with anything.
There are two foreign relations of U.S. volumes on it.
Nobody cares about the law.
The Palestinians kept saying, we want exactly...
Palestinians, they weren't there.
The fucking Ergon terrorist leader. Wait. Is this legal? Hey, fuck me, dude.
Allow me to finish. The Palestinians kept saying, we want what Egypt got. We want what Egypt got.
Yeah.
Egypt got everything
but
back.
Nothing to do with the law.
Okay.
Nothing to do with
And number two, I'm not saying it's the whole picture, but as Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan said at the time, he said, if a car has 4 wheels and you remove one wheel, the car can't move. And for them, removing Egypt
Okay.
from the Arab front would then remove any Arab military
okay.
threat to
Yeah,
Israel.
it's got nothing to do with international law.
Moeen was, no, the first part did. And that's what the Palestinians kept
I don't
saying.
know what the
We
first
want
part is.
what
That-
Egypt got
Yeah,
from
yeah,
the
yeah,
settlement.
that's true. But forget international law.
And by the
Had
way,
nothing to do
one
with
last
the
thing,
negotiation.
one last, on a personal note. The
Uh-oh.
quote about Sharm el-Sheikh without peace.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the only thing you ever cited from a book of mine. You
I cited your book.
Yes. I was absolutely shocked at your betrayal of your people. That was pure treason. It was.
I apologize for that.
Yes.
I apologize.
Okay,
I apologize.
I accept.
All right. Well, let me try once again
Hope
for the
for the
region
future.
and for just entirety of humanity. What gives you hope? We just heard a lot of pessimistic, cynical takes. What gives you
People
hope?
don't like war. That's a good reason. That's hope. In other words, the fear of war, the disaster of war, should give people an impetus to try and seek peace.
When you look at people in Gaza and people in the West Bank, people in Israel,
They should want.
fundamentally they hate war.
Yes, I think so.
What gives you hope?
There is no hope. No, it's an extreme. No, I'm not happy to say that.
Of course you are.
It's a.
Bro, what?
It's a very bleak moment right now.
Oh my
because-
god.
Extreme,
That
no, I'm.
fucking-
Hey,
I think so.
What gives you hope?
there is no hope. No, it's an extreme. No, I'm. Hey, I'm not happy to say that.
Of course you are.
It's a. It's a very bleak moment right now. Because
Oh, Benny.
it's a very bleak moment right now. Because
That I agree with. I agree with.
Israel believes it has to restore what it calls its deterrence capability. I think you've written about it, actually. I just realized. Israel has to restore its deterrence capability. And after the catastrophe of October 7th, restoring its deterrence capacity means this part you didn't write about, the annihilation of Gaza and then moving on to the Hezbollah.
No, that's
So the Israelis are dead set on restoring that deterrence capability. On the Arab side, and I know Moeen and I have disagreed on it, and we're allowed to disagree.
Benny with the cool grandpa energy. I want someone who looks at me the way Benny looks at. Is this Stephen? Oh God.
I think the Arab side, the lesson they learned from October 7th is Israelis aren't as strong as we thought they were. And
that will be an unfortunate message.
and they-
if that's really what the
yeah,
Arabs come to believe.
and they think that there is a military option. now.
Uh-oh. Okay. Invisible. Ah, dinner at 3 a.m. It's 3. Why would you assume my time is your time? You self-centered. All right.
And I think it's a
nasty.
zero-sum game at this point, and it's very, very bleak. And I'm not going to lie about that. Now,
It's a zero-sum game. The problem is, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. But Finkelstein does everything in his power to make it a zero-sum game. The way he talks about Israel. If I only read about Israel through Finkelstein, I would think they need to get invaded by every other country on earth to stop those bloodthirsty, genocidal maniacs who tell their pilots to go and bomb a beach because there are 4 kids there that they just feel like clapping. And do so repeatedly. And have done repeatedly for decades. Like, the fuck? And to lie about raped, beheaded babies in the high 40s just so they can murder their own concentration camp prisoners whilst making them play safety zone musical chairs at the same time. I don't know. I would want Israel to get invaded. if I learned everything from Finkelstein, but I don't know who else.
I will admit my predictive capacities are not
Limited.
perfect, are limited.
Yes, yes.
But for the moment, it's a very bleak situation.
That I agree with.
And I don't see right now a way out. However, at the very minimum, permanent ceasefire and an inhuman and illegal blockade of Gaza and
Why is
free
it
the
illegal? They were
hostages.
shooting rockets at Israel for 20 years.
Okay,
Why is that illegal?
I
To
think-
blockade Gaza.
He thinks they're bottle rockets.
Why,
That's what he calls them on Facebook
why is
multiple
it
times.
illegal? I'll tell you why.
You don't rocket your
Okay,
neighbor. You
I'll
rocket
tell-
your
I'll
neighbor.
tell-
Expect
I'll
consequences.
tell you why.
Expect consequences.
But that works both ways.
Yes,
I know, I expect that.
Professor
Both-
Professor
works
Morris,
both ways.
I'll tell you why. Because every human rights, humanitarian, and UN organization
They're
in the
all
world
irrelevant.
has said
You keep
that the
quoting them.
blockade
Nobody cares
is a
about
form of
amnesty.
is a form of collective punishment,
Nobody cares
which is
about amnesty.
illegal under international
Forget
law.
illegal. The word illegal is-
You think a blockade?
You
which-
don't understand the way
okay,
the world works.
Yeah, and,
These
and
things
you
are
think,
irrelevant.
And you think confining, because that's the blockade.
Yes, you don't shoot
Confining
rockets at your
confining
neighbor.
a million children.
God, he's such a Israeli. No one cares about.
That's the choice of
Combining,
Hamas.
combining
That's
a
Hamas's
million
choice.
children in what the Economist called
Okay.
a human rubbish sheep.
The Economist supported Israel in this war
Yeah.
and continues to support Israel.
What International Committee of the Red Cross called a sinking ship, what the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called a toxic slum. You think
It is a slum, of course it's a slum.
you think
But it's caused by
under
the Hamas.
international law, you think it's legitimate.
Forget
to
law.
Hey, I know you want to forget the law.
What
It's
about
the one
morality?
thing that
Forget
every
law. What about
it's what
morality?
every Israeli fears the most.
What?
The law.
No,
as
no.
Sibi
I don't-
Livni said, I studied international law. I oppose international law. Of course you don't want to hear about the law.
Then it's got nothing to do with anything.
Okay, so here's the thing.
Yeah.
Then don't complain about October 7th. If you don't want
Did you hear me
if you
complaining?
want to say
I didn't
forget about the
complain.
law,
All I said was they acted like
then there
barbarians.
is no international humanitarian.
Jesus. Benny Moore. Benny Moore says rules of the jungle. What the f? He didn't complain about what the f? I didn't complain. I was like, bring it on, boys. What the f is he saying? Yeah. Benny Moore is puffing his big puffy hobbit chest at all of Hamas.
law. There's no distinction between civilians and combatants.
There should be.
And so
There should be, but it's got
no,
nothing to do with
now
the law.
you're doing what Moeen said. You're becoming very selective about the law. If you want to forget about the law, Hamas had
People
every
should
right to
across
do
the
what it
board.
did. It had every right to do what it did, according to you, not to me, because you want to forget the law.
Do you still support the Houthis shooting random ships?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a violation of international law. So you play the same
Absolutely.
game.
Absolutely. And were there a power during World War II who had the courage of the Houthis? Were there a power that had that kind
So
of courage?
courageous to
step-
be bombing
Yeah.
merchant ships while tens of
The courage to where are the f***ing kidnap people? Has there been any updates since the beginning of the stream? I love it. The first thing that comes up is a 2-day-old CNN article. The Gaza conflict's forgotten shipping crew. The courage. These poor f***ing people, bro. It's what the. You think I should do a charity stream for the Galaxy Leader hostage? What did they do? They did nothing. Where are they from? They're Filipinos, Bulgarians, Ukrainians, Mexicans, and Romanian. Those poor bastards. 116 days. There's no indication that the Houthis are open to releasing them until the hostilities end. Bro. Those poor soldiers. We have a minute silence for the Galaxy. I'm sorry, I'm joking. I only say it because no one talks about them. They actually are the forgotten captives. People talk about the Israeli hostages. Loads of people talk about the Gazans dying and starving. No one talks about the Luffy's harem. I don't know.
thousands of people die of actual starvation, not the starvation that exists in the Gaza Strip, where people before our time don't die of starvation.
What
Not
about
that, not the concentration camps in the Gaza
What about,
Strip. The Houthis.
what about starvation in Yemen? Don't they have something
Hey,
better
that
to
was
do?
the Houthis.
Yes, I know.
That was the Houthis.
Don't they have anything
And you
better
know,
to
in
do?
3 years, they lost 180,000
Shouldn't
people.
they be feeding
You
the
know,
Yemenis?
60,000 Yemenis died in starvation.
Why fight the Western powers and Israel when you should be taking care of your problems at home, the Houthis?
Often, the only allies of the dispossessed are those who experience similar circumstances.
Don't you think that they should take care of the Yemeni problems?
As
I'm
I
very
said,
happy. I'm
it's-
very happy they're helping out the Palestinians. Anyone who helps
It's
the
at the
people,
expense of the Yemenis. They'll pay for it.
anybody who comes to the
They're-
aid of those suffering the genocide, half
no
of whom
genocide.
are
There's no
children. Yeah, according to the most current UN reports, as
no
of
genocide.
today, 1/4 of the population of Gaza
Is starving.
That means 500,000 children
Are starving.
are on the verge of famine.
They keep saying on the verge of.
On the verge of-
I have
I
not.
thought- didn't you
I have
quote
not
that they said it
seen.
was unlivable
I have
like
not
15
seen one
years ago?
Palestinian.
I wouldn't dismiss this, right? Because disease is already spreading in Gaza. It's like, and the problem is you can take this position, but the problem with famine is that you reach a critical point. I think this is how it works based on what little I've read, but you reach a critical point and then people just drop like flies in the thousands of either starvation or disease. I don't know if I'd be that dismissive.
Die of starvation in these last 4 months.
Well,
Not one.
there have
They're
been
always on the
documented
verge.
cases.
They're on the verge.
There have been documented cases.
I haven't seen it.
Yesterday, Al Jazeera said 6, and the day before that, they said 2. So those are
Okay.
the 2.
That number probably dies in
You're-
Israel of
you're-
starvation also.
You're so
I don't
laid-
think there's
you're
famine
so
in
laid
Israel.
back.
There isn't. There isn't in the Gaza Strip
You're
either.
so laid back,
It's something
so
which is
blasé.
produced for the
I
Western.
haven't
Western
seen
There are
starving children
infants
yet.
dying due to a engineered lack of access to food and
I don't think it's
nutrition.
engineered. I think if the Hamas stopped shooting, perhaps, or
Unfortunately,
As you
most-
said, engineered.
I think Human Rights Watch called it using starvation as a weapon. That's called engineering.
okay.
That's what they did, but you were pushed on this by Coleman Hughes to bring up like an example of why is the Gaza Strip, like by what metric are they starving? By what metric is it so behind the rest of the
Okay.
world?
You know, if we're going to bring up,
Well, I want to hear an answer to that because he didn't answer
Okay,
it
I'm
before.
happy to answer it.
Yeah.
I just quoted you from the humanitarian organizations. They said 1/4 of the population of Gaza is now verging on famine.
Before October 7th.
Okay,
Before
I'm
October
not
7th.
going before October
That's what you use
7th.
that as justification for Hamas fighting. You say the conditions were unlivable. They
Yeah,
had to fight.
I said to him.
So my question is, what made it unlivable prior to
What made
October
it
7th? What are the
unlivable? Okay,
metrics that you're
okay.
using?
There were about 5, 6, or 7 reports issued by UNCTAD, issued by the World Bank, issued by the International Monetary Fund, and they all said that's why. That's
Why did they say why?
Okay,
Why did they say
That's
that?
why The Economist, not a radical periodical, described Gaza as a human rubbish.
So tell me by what metrics? If
There-
you're a
hey,
historian, if you
okay,
do all this work to
okay,
get things,
here-
tell me what they
here's
said.
something,
Don't just tell me
Mr.
a
Bennell.
sentence. Tell me by what
Mr.
metric.
Bennell,
He's not going to answer again.
I don't think I've avoided any of your questions,
Uh-oh.
except
Well, no,
except when
every
they
question.
breached the threshold of complete imbecility.
you're about to tell me
I've
by what
answered.
metric the Gaza Strip is
okay,
a
I'm going to
humanitarian
answer you.
crisis.
You
Okay.
remember what I said a moment ago? I said to Professor Morris, I defer to expertise.
Probably the difficulties in Gaza for for the metrics of suffering would be unemployment, the water is dirty, lack of appropriate medical care and welfare, probably the main things, and also the fact malnutrition, like food insecurity, and also the fact that if you protest against the economic conditions, Hamas will just kill you, which happened in 2019. Okay.
I look at what the organizations say. I look at what the United Nations High Commissioner
Just
for
say in
Human
more
Rights
words
said.
that you don't know. You don't
I
know or you don't care. Okay,
I don't
that's
know.
fine.
Do you know how complicated? Have you ever investigated how complicated is the metric for hunger, starvation, and famine? It is such a complicated metric they figured out. If you asked me to repeat it now, I couldn't do it.
And yet we have a human development index where we rank countries. Yet we can still measure infant mortality, life expectancy. We can measure all of these things.
Muin, I'm holding out for you here. You still didn't answer the hope question. What gives you a source of hope about the region?
Well, first of all, I would agree with Benny Morris and Norman Finkelstein that the current situation is bleak, and I think it would be unreasonable to expect it to not get even bleaker in the coming weeks and months. And this conflict really, it originated in the late 19th century. It's been a more or less active conflict since the 1920s, 1930s. And it has produced a tremendous amount of suffering and regional conflict and geopolitical complications and all of that. But what gives me hope is that throughout their entire ordeal, the Palestinian people have never surrendered. And I believe they never will surrender to overwhelming force and violence. They have taken everything that Israel has thrown at them. They have taken everything that the West has thrown at them. They have taken everything that those who are supposed to be their natural allies have, on occasion, thrown at them. But this is a people that never has, and I believe never will surrender. And at a certain point, I think Israel and its leaders will have to come to the realization that by hook or by crook, these people are going to achieve their inalienable and legitimate.
It's weird that you call the Arab states natural allies, but then you'll also probably back the idea that Arabs shouldn't give Palestinian citizenship, unless he thinks they should, in which case, good for him.
National rights, and that is going to be a reality.
What do you mean by that? You mean
He thinks they should. He thinks all the refugees should be naturalized in Lebanon, Syria. Well, I guess they can't be in Syria. But that's good for him if he believes that. I think that's true. You're going to say natural allies, especially, yeah. Not exactly. Fucking hell. Okay. I'll have a look. We'll look into it.
the wall of Palestine? Is that what you mean?
No, and
From the river to the sea?
Well, ideally, of course, yes. And what I
Those
was
are the inalienable rights.
no, what I was saying earlier, and then the discussion got sidetracked, is that I did believe that a two-state settlement, a partition of Palestine along the 1967 boundaries, would have been a reasonable solution, because I think it also would have opened pathways to further
But now you believe what?
nonviolent engagement between Israel and the Palestinians that could create other forms of coexistence in a federal or binational or
What do you think
other.
about refugees in regards to that? Do you think there has to be a resettlement of the 5 or 6 million, whoever wants to lay claim to being descendants of?
Return.
I think there has to be an explicit acknowledgement of
Responsibility.
of a responsibility
And the return.
and of the rights. I think that in the framework of a two-state settlement, I think a formula would need to be found that does not undermine the foundations of a two-state settlement. And I don't think it would be that difficult, because I suspect that there are probably large numbers of Palestinian refugees who, once their rights are acknowledged, will find it exceptionally distasteful,
Canada.
exceptionally distasteful to have to live among the kind of sentiments that we've heard around this table today, to be quite frank. I mean, I was previously unfamiliar with you, and I watched one of your preparation videos. Very disconcerting stuff, I have to say. You were explaining 2 days ago in the discussion about apartheid and how absurd it was, that in your view, Jim Crow was not apartheid. Jim Crow was not apartheid. But Arab states not giving citizenship to Palestinian refugees is apartheid. That's what I meant
Sure.
with my earlier comment.
That's
I think it's a bit silly when Destiny says that like Lebanon is like apartheid, but he won't apply the standard to Jim Crow. But yeah, I don't think that's a good comparison, because again, if you want to be specific with the wording of the apartheid law, it's quite stringent. Okay, I don't think it's just going to include, especially if the reason that Lebanon doesn't give citizenship. Yeah, I feel like it's the kind of thing where you run into this trap of how does it apply to Israel then? No, I'm saying if you're going to reject it for Israel, if you're going to reject it for Jim Crow, then you should reject it for Lebanon. It's not the same thing. It's that kind of thing where like the standard of evidence changes depending on which side, which is pretty unavoidable, but
It's about white
it's a
supremacy.
solidarity thing. Well, for some Lebanese people, it's the solidarity thing. For others, it's the will get wrecked as Christians if we're backing a strong Muslim majority, right? Like, yeah, it's fear just as much as it is like supremacy or racism, or
Supremacy.
So my issue, that's great, the white supremacy comment.
And if
Hold on, let me respond.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
my issue is that I feel like we have jumped on this euphemistic treadmill, and I think that's part of the reason why this conflict will never get solved. Is because on one end you've got a people who are now convinced internationally that they're victims of apartheid, genocide, concentration camp conditions, ethnic cleansing. They're forced to live in an open air prison with all of these things that are stacked against.
I wonder what they would say, because I feel like if I believed all that, then I want to know what they would both say is like, when countries do all those kind of things, generally we would invade them. That's what we used to do. But I mean, they'd probably say BDS or some shit. Yeah.
Them all of these terms that are highly specific, that refer to very precise things, and then when
I
people
would
like you say that
expect
they
nothing
should,
less from someone who doesn't think Jim Crow is apartheid.
I don't know if
But who does
because
think that Arab
because
states
the problem
not
is you're
giving
morally loading.
Palestinian-
For you, apartheid is when racists do bad things.
No,
Right?
no. There's a definition of apartheid.
That's great. But
There's a very
the
clear
specific
definition of
top-down
apartheid.
racial domination enacted through top-down, like federal legislative policies or whatever.
Yeah, but obviously because Jim Crow wasn't federal, in some cases it was states bypassing the federal law. So, and that's why the civil rights protesters, if anything, their message, although they were civil disobedient and all that, if anything, their message was actually about pulling southern states in line with a higher law of the land. Like they were, yeah. But again, it's just a technicality. I don't know. Yeah, fucking. Surely you agree they're victims of apartheid. I think if you want to call the West Bank conditions apartheid, it makes sense. Yeah, go for it. Like, yeah.
Means that I don't know if
I wouldn't split hairs over that, right? Especially with a legal term that doesn't have any precedent. So it could either be loosened compared to what people understand it to be currently, or it could be broadened. It can be either, or it can be tightened. It doesn't, but it hasn't. It's not really a law that's ever been practiced. So you can kind of, it's up for debate how that law is interpreted.
I don't know if Jim Crow would have qualified for apartheid. That doesn't make it any less. Excuse me, Finkelstein. I'm talking right now. Excuse me, Finkelstein. I'm talking to your friend over here. I don't know if it would qualify as the crime of apartheid. Just like if Israel were to literally nuke the Gaza Strip and kill 2 million people, I don't know if that would qualify for the crime of genocide.
In your eyes, probably not.
I don't. Well, yeah, but because genocide requires a special intent. I think the issue is instead of, and I think this conversation actually is emblematic of the entire conversation. I don't think anything.
Let me finish answering.
Well, sure, but you accused me of supporting racism. So yeah,
well,
I think
did.
And you are. I did it. Do you think I support Jim Crow laws?
Look,
the fact that you can't even answer that honestly.
It doesn't matter what.
Say that 800 civilians were killed by Hamas. You said, well, maybe 400 were killed by Israel.
No,
I don't know the number.
Maybe
no,
I didn't say
you said 400.
No, I didn't.
You co-signed the opinion.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't.
Oh, well, wait. How many? What do you? I think the word was some. That's what I heard.
No.
Well, you weren't listening.
How many people do you think approximately, if you had to ballpark it, how many do you think were killed by Hamas on October 7th?
I think it's pretty clear that the majority of civilians that were killed,
51%. Or 90%.
Don't ask me to put a number on something I don't know.
Different intuitions.
First of all, when you say Hamas, do you mean Palestinians or do you mean Hamas specifically?
I mean the invading Palestinian force. I don't like to say Palestinians because I don't think all Palestinian civilians were involved. No. I'll say Hamas, Islamic Jihad, whatever outcomes.
But that's how this discussion started. You said Hamas and I began to answer that. And then Benny Morris said...
Or marauding Arabs. Was it the Benny statement? Marauding Arabs. I guess like civilian, like Gazan civilians who came through to attack people. Yeah.
Actually, he means Hamas in addition to jihad and the others. So
of the invading Palestinian force, how many do you think killed civilians versus the IDF? What do you think of the ballpark, the percentage?
Well, the figures we have are that about a third of the casualties on October 7th were military.
That's
about two-thirds were... What's your question?
That's not answering the question. I wonder if it's... Sometimes I wonder about people who have quite big audiences. It sometimes feels like there are just certain things they don't talk about because they might believe one thing, but they don't really know where their audience sits on it. I just don't know. Yeah.
What percentage of civilians do you think were killed by the invading force?
I think a clear majority, but I can't give you a specific figure.
If you thought it was closer to 51% or 99% were killed by...
Why would you know that? How would you know
because
that?
it's interesting to actually stake out a position.
Yeah, it's interesting.
If you want to be completely agnostic on it, that's
based on
fine.
complete ignorance, because we don't know. Professor Morris doesn't know. Muin Rabbani doesn't know.
You can speak with absolute certainty that the IDF is targeting and murdering Palestinian children intentionally. Do you see the double standard?
No, I don't. You see?
I know you don't. It was a rhetorical question. Obviously,
you know why? Because I looked at the UN report. I looked at the
Goldstone report?
No, the UN report on the Great March of Return in 2018. And they said that the snipers were targeting children, medics, journalists, and disabled people.
Just as they are now in this conflict.
Exactly.
No, more journalists have been killed in the last several months in Gaza than in any other conflict.
And then in all of World War II. Hamas
is not killing journalists in the Gaza
Strip.
Strip.
Do you agree that they operate in civilian uniforms, that their goal is to induce that confusion? That that's the way that they conduct themselves militarily?
Let me finish my point. More journalists have been more
children.
He doesn't want to hear it. So
no, because it's virtue. It's so having a material, a substantial. It is virtue signaling. Yes, like when you say children over and over again. That's virtue signaling.
Talking about how many Israelis were killed. That's not.
What's the question supposed to demonstrate? The question is supposed to demonstrate the fact that if you look at actual stories that have credibility so far, it seems to be that the amount of people who were killed by Israeli friendly fire is not going to be higher than 20. Okay? The two credible stories, I think, I don't even know how credible one of them is friendly fire at the festival, at the bit in the confusion, and which was barely anything, and then the bigger number would be the 14 who died when that tank fired on that house that had hostages in it. When the Israeli tank. There's 14 that are basically 100% were killed by Israeli-friendly fire. 12 in the house? Oh, that was 14 in the house. Which is why it's the reasonable answer would be that like 90+% of the civilians were killed by the invading Palestinian force. But there is a fringe out there that because they misunderstand a very badly chopped up quote from one helicopter dude, and because of a video that's completely green and you have no idea where it's coming from, but they assume that it's the kibbutz, the Nova Festival. Yeah, there are some people who think it was like half, like the IDF killed like half of their own people. So it's a good litmus test to see how much of a conspiracy shithead you are.
Not virtue signaling, because that's human life.
I don't care about it. I don't care if 100 are killed or 1,000.
You just interrogated him. 51%, 90%.
The question, yes, that's not the number. That's the responsibility norm.
And then Muin mentions that more journalists were killed in Gaza than in all of World War II.
That doesn't further any part of the
more
conversation.
Medics were killed.
No, that's silly.
And then he says it's virtue signaling.
In the area.
But when Israelis get killed, that's serious.
I never said it's serious on both sides.
Yeah,
I
tear
didn't say
off
respectful.
virtue
No,
signaling.
I'm not virtue signaling.
signaling.
I'm asking a substantive question of who do you assign blame to, or do you play into Norm Finkelstein's conspiracies
I
that the
think
ambulances should have known immediately who was dead, that the numbers were changed because they were
Mr.
fake,
Burrell,
or that maybe
Mr. Burrell,
51% of the
Mr.
people were
Burrell,
killed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but
Let me ask
49% were killed by
You
IDF
asked me-
helicopters.
You asked me a direct question, and you got a direct answer.
I didn't. I got majority, which could be
I
from
said a clear,
51
I
to
said
99.
a clear majority.
What
were my
percent is a
facts.
clear majority? As
It's
opposed to a
always they
majority?
live in
Clear
ambiguity.
majority, in my view, is well over 50%. Please don't ask me to
Well-
be more precise.
Well over 50% can be like 51 though, or 55. Fuck me.
Because
You could say 80, 90, 95.
I don't. If I knew that, I would say it.
I think it's a reasonable. It's a reasonable.
Perhaps it is, but I.
You're not the best person to be asking that question. I read when you described Operation Defensive Shield,
Oh,
and you said
God.
a few dozen homes were destroyed.
You're talking about what happened in Jenin refugee camp.
And you said
No, the
you
Arabs said
a few-
500. You guys
a
said
few
500
you said a few-
Palestinians were killed in
No,
Jenin.
no,
I
no.
never said
And
that.
then
I
no,
never said
but that was the statement of the
Professor
PLO,
Morris, I'm
the
quoting
Palestinian
you.
Authority.
You said a few dozen.
And that there were
homes were
massacres there.
There were a few dozen.
Yes,
homes
a few
were
dozen homes.
Yeah. Well, it
That's
turned
right.
out 140 buildings were destroyed.
a few dozen.
5,000 people. 5,000 people were left homeless.
How many
You
were
just
killed?
5,000.
How many
You
were killed?
described it. No, I'm talking about homes destroyed.
Did Finkelstein originally say 500? Now he doesn't want to own it. Hang on. Battle of Jenin. Is this 2000? Operation Defensive Shield. 2002, right? Yeah. What does Wikipedia say? I just want to consult the Wikipedia because I feel like Wikipedia is a really good source just to get you into a ballpark. There can be inaccuracies. Sometimes there are really bad inaccuracies in Wikipedia, but it's never going to send you to the moon like some of these other partisan sources will. So I think it's fair. I just reasonable to start. 23 Israelis dead. 52 Palestinians dead. At least 27 militants. 22 civilians. Dozens of houses destroyed. Oh, wait. According to Human Rights Watch, 140. Ah. So whoever said 500, wait. Did Norman Finkelstein really say buildings, not houses? Is that the... How did they get so many houses? How did they get so many collateral houses? The Jenin massacre. Was it a massacre if 52 dead? It depends on how these 22 civilians were killed. Tanzim, Al-Aqsa Martyrs, Islamic Jihad. At least 28 suicide bombers were dispatched from the camp. Okay. 124 victims. So they go in here because there are attacks. Okay. Just skimming, just getting a ballpark. I'm not going to give any strong conclusions. Why is there such a massive dispute over how many houses were destroyed or buildings? Is it because one metric is houses and the other one's buildings? Demolished area. Removal of bodies. Uh-oh. Damages. 4,000 people homeless. 140 buildings, most of which housed multiple families, completely destroyed. Israel said these numbers were exaggerations. Has there been any conclusion? They say completely destroyed. They're not saying damaged. Well, where's 500 dead coming from? Oh. This dude said 500 dead. No. Where's Mr. Binkelstein? He's not in the Wikipedia. He never really gets a Wikipedia citation, does he? Mr. Finkelstein.
So you're not the best person to be criticizing what Moeen says when he says clear majority, but he can't say more. You know why he can't say more?
He doesn't.
He doesn't know.
Yeah, I understand that.
I
understood
hope
that
as a
point.
historian.
If I was trying to belittle, I would give you a very different answer. I would just say, I don't know. I do know
the
that
right
some were
phrase. You know
shot
what
up.
the right phrase there would be? The overwhelming majority were killed by Arab gunmen. and very small number were killed by Israelis by accident or whatever.
You're not
That's
speaking as a
probably true.
historian,
That's
though.
probably
That
true.
that may
don't
be.
know
I can state with confidence a clear majority, overwhelming majority. You may be correct, but I can't state that with certainty. I think there's a very easy way to find out: is to have an independent.
Forget independent.
I know
Exactly.
you
Well,
don't.
How are
of
these guys so sure about the amount of children who are dying in Gaza then? Fuck it.
Course, you forget
Forget the
independent.
law.
Forget that doesn't
Again,
mean
I would say you can generally take the health ministry's numbers at face value because they're usually about right. So, but for some reason, like the I don't think know if the demographics, like the percentages of women and children.
Forget the law. Forget
Independent
international
UN
law,
High Commissioner
Forget
for
independent
Not
human
commissioners.
rights,
No,
not necessarily.
just repeat
They're
the numbers.
all
Just
from
repeat the
barbaric
Israeli numbers.
countries. Assyrian was the head of the UN Commission for Human Rights.
But if it was
A
an
Libyan-
Israeli, it would have been okay.
he certainly would have been more
Yeah,
honest than
of
Assyrian.
course. Oh yeah, from your perspective.
But to disagree with Stephen,
Oh my God, he's my dad. That's something my dad would say. He wouldn't say that about an Israeli, I don't think. But the comment about Assyrian, yeah, for sure. God.
thought this was extremely valuable. And at times, really, like the view of history, the passion. I'm really grateful
Oh.
that you would spend your really valuable time. And just one more question, since we have two historians here. Well, just briefly, from a history perspective, what do you hope your legacy as historians, Benny and Norm, will be of the work that you've put out there? Maybe Norm, you can go first and try to just say briefly.
I think there's a value to preserving the record. I'm not optimistic about where things are going to end up. There was a very nice book written by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson at the end of the 19th century describing what was done to the Native Americans. She called it a century of dishonor. And she described in vivid, poignant detail what was done to the Native Americans. Did it save them? No. Did it help them? Probably not. Did it preserve their memory? Yes. And I think there's a value to that. You know, there was a famous film by Sergei Eisenstein. It was either Battleship Potemkin or Mother. I can't remember which one. The last scene was
I'm
the Tsar's
caving,
troops
guys.
mowing down
I'm
all
speeding
the
up.
Russian people. He pans the scene.
Not all the Russian people. just a few,
Yeah,
few.
well, he pans the massacre.
But he could have killed a lot more.
And the last words of the movie were proletarians, exclamation point, remember, exclamation point. And I've seen it as my life's work to preserve the memory and to remember. I didn't expect that anyone would read my book on Gaza. It's very dense. It gives me even a bit of a headache to read at least one of the chapters.
You wrote a book on Gaza.
And but I thought that the memory deserves to be preserved.
Amen.
Well, I would just say very briefly, unlike my colleague, I think writing the truth about what happened in history, in various periods of history, if I've done a little bit of that, I'm happy.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you, Benny. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Wayne.
Unlike
Thanks for
my
listening to this
colleagues,
conversation with
bro.
Norm Finkelstein, Benny Morris, Wayne Rabani, and Stephen Bunnell. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me leave you with some words from Lyndon B. Johnson. Peace is a journey of 1,000 miles, and it must be taken one step at a time. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time.
What a fucking dude, man. Lex. Benny is such a troll. He is very physically troll-like as well, isn't he? I mean, it was entertaining, but it's just sad. It's sad that that's kind of where the discussion devolves into. When the problem with the Israel-Palestine conflict is obviously it's very unique and it's very interesting to learn about, and it's very multidisciplinary. Like you do law, you do history, you do rules of war, you do all that shit. Politics, obviously. A lot of culture, religion, a little bit. But you also have a situation where if nothing changes, one group is just going to get wiped out. They're either going to get erased and moved somewhere else, or they're all going to die. And I feel like I find very few people who are interested in finding ways to stop that from happening. Or maybe it's just that they actually do think they have very easy answers, like you're fucking just do a one-state solution or a ceasefire, and like or free maybe they do think that the answer is just obvious, and as if we're just loud and obnoxious enough, people will listen. And even though Israel's winning in terms of the war, it's not good for them either, because they're just like a bunch of like. I imagine there was a point probably after 48 where Jewish people might have felt that they had finally found a state that they could be safe in and free of persecution and all that. But then, you get 5 wars and the intifadas, and you get rockets flying over your heads all the time, and that fucks your head up. And now that most of them are born there, that's what they grow up in. And then you get October 7th, right? And I don't think that necessarily is going to beget the most chill people. So, but it does sound like people like Finkelstein are already writing the eulogy whilst preaching the most fucking useless contributions that you could possibly deliver just to enrich themselves or to let everyone know how many pages there are in each book that you've read 17 times. Yeah, it's just kind of gross.